Raise your hand if at some point in your life you've made a conscious decision to stop watching the news because it had a negative impact on your mood. Me too. In 2020, a few months of the pandemic had passed and things weren't looking so great. So my family also decided to stop watching the news because the psychological cost of staying updated was no longer worth it for me, a 12-year-old who felt completely helpless. When I just turned 13, it had been 4 years since being diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. But I was actually being evaluated for a different condition when we realized that my anxiety had really gotten to a concerning level. And we couldn't tell if I actually had this other condition or not because my anxiety symptoms were so severe. You see, my anxiety had morphed into a deep depression. And I had become desensitized to my symptoms of constant elevated heart rate and inability to sleep at night. And while there were many other factors that contributed to my decline in mental health, a big one was overconsumption of the news and how it was reported. It's important to note that watching the news didn't give me an anxiety disorder. I already had it. But it did exacerbate my pre-existing susceptibility to debilitating fear. And it's equally important to note that being said, anyone can be victim to the stress that comes from constantly seeing negativity in the news. It's very likely that at some point in the last couple years, you've experienced negative news fatigue. Negative news fatigue is exactly what it sounds like. You're constantly engaging with new news, new headlines, and constantly trying to tread the turbulent waters of potential misinformation and troubling headlines, until all you want is the sweet relief of a life jacket. And for many people, that life jacket is in the form of avoiding the news completely. Professor Hee-Soo Jung is currently affiliated with the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she received her PhD from UNC Hussman School of Journalism. And she says that negative news fatigue is a mental sign from your brain that it needs a break, and that you need to give it a rest before you try to introduce more information. But for many people, the idea of taking a short break and then jumping right back into the chaos of the news is not very appealing. According to a 2022 study by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, 38% of respondents reported that they avoid watching the news because it has a negative impact on their mental health. And while on a personal level, I can absolutely empathize with the rationale that goes behind news avoidance, it's also crucial that we don't overlook the negative consequences of such a vast portion of the population being unable to engage with the news. Because when we remove ourselves from the news and from information sharing, we also remove ourselves from important conversations, and they lose our perspective and voices, which is why it's so important that we're conscious of how we're processing the news and how it affects the world around us. Headline anxiety and stress disorder is another term coined by Doctor of Psychology Stephen Stolzny to describe how the physical manifestations of negative news fatigue can affect your body. This includes things like symptoms such as your heart rate quickening before you even get to the right channel, out of anticipation because you're so used to anticipating the worst when you turn on the news, or being unable to rid your brain of a troubling headline you saw earlier in the day as you're trying to go to sleep. Similarly, secondary trauma or compassion fatigue relates to how you can actually take on symptoms of trauma yourself by watching traumatic pictures, videos, and coverage, and children are especially susceptible. Now, it's hard to tell if, because of the rise of social media in the last decade, if the news has actually gotten to be more negative or if it's just an illusion. But another 2022 study reveals that it actually has gotten more negative. It used language models trained to track connotations such as anger, fear, and sadness across 47 of America's most popular news companies and surveyed over 23 million headlines. And what it found was that there's a direct relationship between the passage of time in the last 20 years and a decrease in positive sentiment, which is not surprising, but is upsetting. And this relationship with social media is no coincidence. In fact, I believe it's cyclical. People get information on social media, they feel the need to add to it, even if unqualified, and then they share it. And then more people decide to comment on it, and then they share it. And that leads to lots of people being more likely to share negative information because there's more to comment on and more opinion to share. And that leads to a lot of content for people to doom scroll, which essentially means that you sit there scrolling, unable to pull away from the captivating negativity and trauma. And so this is a big issue that especially affects young people. And it's important to recognize while you're scrolling that you're encountering a lot of negative news. But it'd be a bit hypocritical of me to come up here and just spill all these depressing facts and statistics without offering some solutions. So let's get into that. So there are many ways you can help limit your negative news intake. First of all, the American Psychological Association promotes dietary media restriction, which essentially means that you're setting aside time within your day to stay away from the news and time in your day to look at the news and get an update of the day, which keeps you from being tempted to doom scroll and find information and being conscious about what information you choose to look at within that allotted time. Another option is to limit how much information you get from sources such as social media networks like TikTok and Instagram, which are literally endless cesspools of information to doom scroll over. And finally, make sure you're reflecting on whether you value the opinions of your friends and family over the opinions of anonymous people online, because chances are you value the opinions of your friends and family more, so it's important that you divvy up your time to reflect that. Instead of spending hours seeing what people online say when you don't even know what their faces look like, instead, try talking to your family about issues that concern you to help gain perspective and perhaps ease some of your concerns. It's extremely beneficial to be picky about where you get your news from. And on top of making sure the news you get is accurate, fact-checked, unbiased, and as objective as possible, you can also check for some of these criteria. There's an up-and-coming movement in journalism called constructive journalism, and it addresses the fact that a lot of times published media today doesn't address the needs of the public. And so part of the pillars of constructive journalism are solution, nuanced conversation, and shared discussions. And this means that by incorporating solutions-based reporting into the news, we can help people channel their stress into actual proactive service, which not only benefits society, but it also helps them channel their stress that they might get from the news into something productive, which helps them not feel tempted to turn away from the news because of negative media fatigue. So in turn, it's very important that we help support news companies and organizations that promote constructive journalism to help build resilience. It might seem counterintuitive, but by limiting our intake of negative news, we can actually set ourselves up to be more positive contributors to causes we care about. If we sit doom scrolling or force ourselves to look at news that upsets us and is damaging to our mental health, we're more likely to burn out and to succumb to feelings of helplessness. But if we're conscious about what we're consuming and how it's affecting us psychologically, we can conserve our energy. And that's energy that we can use to promote and get involved with causes we care about. Thank you.